Okay, so right now I am in Red Rock Canyon just outside of Las Vegas testing out the new Viltrox 24mm f1.8 lens for Sony full frame cameras. And I have to say, I'm quite impressed. I mean, you can't really shoot anything bad here with any lens, but this lens performs quite well. The f1.8 looks really good on full frame, has really shallow depth of field even at 24mm, which is really rare and looks really good in my opinion. So I'm really enjoying it. There are some quirks about this lens, of course, like there are with any lens, especially since this is more of a budget lens, you could say, but overall getting some pretty cool shots and just enjoying the beautiful scenery here. So enjoy the review. Okay, so now let's actually talk about this lens, and just for reference, this is currently shooting on the 24mm lens at f1.8, so just to get an idea of how shallow the background can look and what the characteristics of this lens are like, this is what it actually looks like. But talking about the lens, let me cover the pros of it first. So the first thing I want to talk about is the price of this lens. It's currently $429, which may seem like a bit expensive for some people, but if you know anything about lenses, you know, especially on full frame cameras with autofocus and a shallow depth of field, that is a really good price. Usually lenses would cost around $800 or more for Sony full frame, so $429 is definitely on the budget side. So keep that in mind when I'm talking about the lens. The second pro I want to talk about with this lens is the autofocus. It works really, really well inside of Sony cameras. Sony has really good autofocus, but this lens definitely delivers and works really well. Here you can see some tests I did with it, and I'm quite impressed. It's a bit slower than some of their nicer lenses, but I would say it's still very usable in most situations, and there's not really that much focus breathing when you're shooting on it. The minimum focus distance isn't that close to the lens, it's about a foot away, but on wider angle lenses, you don't usually need to get that close to the lens, so not a huge deal, but not super close as well. Another pro to this lens is the adjustable aperture on the lens itself. A lot of these newer lenses that have autofocus and all these things are only controllable for aperture through the camera itself, but this actually has a ring on the outside that you can turn and adjust it manually that way. However, something interesting about it is that it doesn't actually manually change the aperture if the lens is not connected electronically to the camera, so it's only an electronic dial basically that allows it to change that way, but it is still nice to have a aperture that you can change on camera, but you can also just set it to the auto mode and you can just adjust it inside of camera like you would any other lens. And then another pro to this lens is just the build quality of the lens itself. It feels very high quality, lots of metal on the outside actually, which makes it sort of heavy, but because of that, it feels like a really solid lens. It's not going to break anytime soon, and you can just throw it in your bag, not have to worry about it being too plasticky or anything like that. It looks good on the camera and feels solid. And then the last pro I have for this lens is the shallow depth of field. At f1.8 on a full frame camera, you can get some really shallow depth of field even at 24mm. As you can see right now, the background's quite blurry for me being like 2 feet away from the camera, so that looks really good. It makes low light shots really, really good, and I just like having a shallow depth of field. So for this price range, f1.8 is a pretty good depth of field. But because this is a budget lens after all, there definitely are some cons to this lens, and I really want to cover them because you do not want to buy this lens not knowing these things and then get it and realize that it has all these sorts of issues. So let me jump into those. The first two issues I have aren't huge deals, but you should be aware of them. First of all, on low apertures like f1.8, you can see some vignetting on the edges of the shot. So around here, there's definitely some vignetting that goes on. So yeah, like f1.8 to f4, you will see some vignetting in the corners, and that's really only apparent when you're shooting more landscape type things, which you usually don't want to shoot at a low aperture like that. But if you're doing that, you will definitely see some vignetting, which isn't the end of the world, but it's a bit annoying. And then the second minor annoyance I have is that there is some distortion on the sides of the lens, when you're shooting because it is a 24mm lens, which is on the wider spectrum of lenses. So there is a bit of distortion. You can see it especially if you shove someone up into the very corner of the shot. Like right now, as I go over from this corner here and I come around, you can see that there is a bit of distortion there. So it's not terrible, but you should be aware of it when you're shooting. Okay, so the last con that I have is by far the worst. It's pretty hard to ignore, especially if you're shooting anywhere outdoors, but the flaring on this lens is absolutely horrible. If you get any sort of sun ray coming into the lens at the wrong angle, it's going to create these horrible flares that pretty much just ruin the entire shot. So you really have to be aware of that. Either have a massive lens hood on the front or just don't shoot into the sun or in areas that have sunlight, because it will dramatically affect your image. I'm not exactly sure why this is happening because I've never seen any sort of flare like this ever on any other lens, even other budget lenses. So I'm not sure if this is something they can fix in the future with their glass or something like that, but right now it's pretty obvious and not great. Also, if you stop down your aperture to like f16 or something to try and get some sun stars from the sun or just other types of flares, they also look a bit funky, not super symmetrical like you'd find on nicer lenses. So there's definitely some weird artifacts and lens element issues going on in there. But for the most part, you don't notice these things, but you should be aware of them because if you're outdoors, they may very well happen. Anyway, that's basically all I have to say about this lens. I think it is a very good budget option if you don't have $800 to $1,200 to buy an actually nice high-end 24mm lens. So the price definitely is a benefit, and for most situations, this lens looks really good, has good autofocus, has a nice shallow depth of field, and if you're shooting at night, you can't go wrong with this lens, but there are just a few issues you want to keep in mind before you pick it up. The link to buy the lens, if you're interested, is down below as always, but that's it for today. If you like this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps me out a lot, and I will see you all next week.